Most men do not meet consequence when it begins. They meet it when it becomes too loud to ignore. The broken routine, the damaged relationship, the lost discipline, the pressure that suddenly feels impossible to escape. But the collapse was not the beginning. The beginning was smaller. One ignored warning, one protected excuse, one repeated cause that looked harmless because it did not hurt yet. This is not about blaming yourself for everything. Some conditions are real. Some pressures are external. But wherever a repeated cause belongs to you, the law will not negotiate with your excuse. Natural law has real consequences because cause does not disappear when you refuse to name it. It repeats. It gathers weight. It becomes effect. And by the end, you will know how to take one visible collapse in your life and trace it backward to the first small cause you kept allowing. Because the most dangerous moment is not when the door closes. It is when the first domino falls and you call it nothing. So before natural law becomes a concept, it has to become visible. Not as a theory, not as a belief system, not as a lecture, as a chain. Because most men misunderstand consequence for one simple reason. They think the law begins when the pain begins. They think the law starts when the door cracks, when the pressure arrives, when the relationship breaks, when the discipline disappears, when the money is gone, when the body is exhausted, when the mind cannot focus anymore. But the law was already active before the pain. It was active when the cause was still quiet. It was active when the excuse still sounded reasonable. It was active when the first domino looked too small to matter. Most people understand cause and effect when it happens outside them. If a man touches fire, he expects heat. If he drops glass on stone, he expects it to break. If he plants nothing, he does not expect a harvest. But the moment the same principle enters his behavior, his attention, his habits, his conscience, or his relationships, he suddenly wants an exemption. He wants repeated causes to produce different effects because his intentions were good. He wants ignored warnings to disappear because he was under pressure. He wants broken promises to leave no mark because nobody else saw them. He wants the final collapse to be treated as separate from the chain that produced it. This is where natural law becomes uncomfortable. Not because it is mystical, not because it is hidden behind complicated terminology, but because it removes the fantasy that consequence requires your agreement. A law does not need you to like it. A law does not need you to believe in it. A law does not need you to understand it before it operates. It only needs participation. And participation is often quieter than people imagine. It is not always a dramatic betrayal of yourself. Sometimes it is the small thing you keep allowing because it does not look serious yet. The late night you call harmless. The conversation you avoid because silence feels easier today. The resentment you refuse to address because pride feels safer than honesty. The promise you break to yourself because nobody else can hold you accountable. The distraction you keep feeding because it gives you relief for a moment. Each one looks small when viewed alone. But natural law does not measure the isolated excuse. It measures the repeated cause. That is the first shift this video has to make in your mind. The consequence is not proof that life suddenly turned against you. The consequence is often proof that a cause was allowed to keep moving. And that is why this cannot become a motivation speech. Motivation asks how you feel. A law asks what you repeat. Motivation rises and falls. A law continues. Motivation needs emotion. A law only needs cause. If the cause is repeated, the effect is being prepared. You may not see it yet. You may not feel it yet. You may still have language to defend it. But the chain is already moving. The cause that controls a man is usually not the one he fears. It is the one he respects too little. A man does not usually lose command in one obvious collapse. He loses it in the repeated moment where he says, "This does not matter." One more delay, one more compromise, one more night of numbing himself, one more avoided conversation, one more broken promise, one more refusal to confront the thing he already knows is beginning again. And because nothing immediately explodes, he mistakes delay for permission. This is the trap. The first cause does not always punish you immediately. If it did, most men would correct it. The danger is that the first cause often gives you relief. That is why it survives. The distraction gives relief. The excuse gives relief. The avoidance gives relief. The silence gives relief. The comfort gives relief. And because relief feels like escape, the mind calls it harmless. But relief is not proof that a cause is harmless. Sometimes relief is the reward that keeps the cause alive long enough to become consequence. This is why repeated collapse can look mysterious from the outside. A man says, "I do not know why I keep ending up here." But if he tells the truth, there was a pattern. There was always a repeated input. There was always a first signal. There was always a sentence he used to protect it. Just tonight. I will fix it tomorrow. It is not that serious. I deserve this. I am under pressure. I know what I am doing. Those sentences are not random. They are the language of the mechanism. They are the mind defending the cause before the consequence arrives. Once the cause is protected by language, it can repeat without being examined. This is why the smallest causes are often the most dangerous. Not because they are powerful in one instance, but because they are easy to repeat. A single skipped task may not destroy discipline, but the repeated habit of breaking command over small tasks trains the mind to expect surrender. A single avoided conversation may not destroy a relationship, but repeated avoidance teaches silence to replace courage. A single compromise may not destroy conscience, but repeated compromise teaches the inner voice to speak more quietly. At some point, the man does not simply have a problem, he has a pattern. And once the pattern becomes normal, consequence is no longer a surprise, it is only delayed. Consequence feels sudden because pain concentrates at the end. Cause does not. Cause is distributed. It is spread across days, weeks, months, sometimes years. A small decision here, a neglected duty there, a repeated emotional reaction, a repeated failure to define what is happening. A repeated refusal to tell the truth when the truth would force correction. The cause is quiet because it comes in pieces. The effect is loud because it arrives as a total. That is why the mind misreads the sequence. It remembers the moment the door collapsed. It forgets every domino it allowed to fall. This is visible everywhere. A man wakes up exhausted and says he is burned out. But the chain may have started with months of refusing order, ignoring rest, scattering attention, and treating his body like a machine without consequence. A man says his money disappeared. But the chain may have started with repeated leaks, emotional spending, avoided numbers, and the refusal to look at the receipt until pressure became undeniable. A man says the relationship broke suddenly, but the chain may have started with 100 small withdrawals of honesty. Avoided conflict, delayed apology, hidden resentment, pride disguised as patience. A man says he cannot focus anymore, but the chain may have started with repeated attention surrender. Every notification obeyed, every impulse followed, every quiet moment filled because stillness felt uncomfortable. None of these causes looked like collapse in the moment. That is exactly why they were allowed. This is the mechanic most people miss. The mind respects dramatic events more than repeated causes. It fears collapse more than pattern. But the pattern is what builds the collapse. Natural law is not confused by your timeline. It does not say, he only noticed the effect today, so the cause must have started today. It follows the chain. It follows the repetition. It follows the input. Then it returns the output. This is why the title matters. Natural law has real consequences because reality is not moved by your preferred explanation. It is moved by what is repeated. At this point, resistance usually appears. Because when a man hears this, part of him says, "So everything is my fault?" No, that is not the argument. And if the script said that, it would be false. Some conditions are outside your control. Some pressures are inherited. Some events are imposed. Some people act against you. Some systems are designed to capture attention, weaken judgment, and reward obedience. To deny that would be naive. But to use that as permission to ignore your repeated causes is also naive. The serious question is not, did I control every condition? The serious question is, where did my participation enter the chain? That glowing link is the point of power, not the whole chain, not every condition, not every external pressure. The link you can actually see, the link you can test, the link you can interrupt. This is the difference between blame and diagnosis. Blame says, you are bad. Diagnosis says, this is where the cause enters. Blame wants shame. Diagnosis wants correction. Blame traps the ego in defense. Diagnosis gives the will a place to act. That distinction matters because shame can become another excuse. A man feels guilty, so he collapses deeper. He says, I always ruin things. Then he uses that identity to avoid the next correction. That is not responsibility. That is self-punishment disguised as awareness. Responsibility is colder than that. Cleaner, more useful. It does not ask you to hate yourself. It asks you to stop lying about the cause. If the cause is not yours, identify the condition. If the cause is partly yours, identify the link. If the cause repeats through your choice, your comfort, your silence, your attention, your fear, or your excuse, then that is where natural law is giving you information. Not condemnation, information. A consequence is not only punishment, sometimes it is a receipt. It tells you what has been purchased by repetition. And the moment you can read the receipt, you are no longer trapped inside the illusion that the result came from nowhere. Now the question becomes practical, not emotional, not philosophical. Practical. Take one visible consequence in your life, not 10, one. Choose something that keeps returning. A failure of discipline, a repeated conflict, a financial pressure, a loss of focus, a pattern of avoidance, a quiet moral compromise. Something visible enough that you can no longer pretend it is imaginary. Then do not begin with the pain. Begin with the chain. First, name the consequence. Be precise. Not my life is a mess. That is too vague. Say, I keep missing the morning window. Say, I keep avoiding hard conversations. Say, I keep spending money before I look at what I owe. Say, I keep surrendering attention before I choose where it goes. A vague consequence cannot be traced. A precise consequence can. Second, ask when the first signal appeared, not when the collapse happened. When the first warning appeared, the moment you knew the pattern was beginning again. The first crack, the first domino, the first quiet signal that said, this is how it starts. Third, identify the repeated cause. What kept happening before the consequence appeared? What did you keep doing? What did you keep avoiding? What did you keep consuming? What did you keep tolerating? What did you keep calling harmless? Fourth, write the excuse that protected it. This is important, because the excuse is often the guard standing in front of the cause. If you do not identify the excuse, the cause will hide again. It may sound like, "I will fix it tomorrow. I am too tired. This is not the right time. It is only once. They made me do it. I had no choice. I work better under pressure. I deserve a break." Maybe some of those sentences are partly true. That is what makes them effective. The strongest excuses are not always lies. They are half-truths used to protect a repeated cause. Fifth, identify the next interruption point, not the grand transformation, not the perfect new identity. The next interruption point. Where can the next domino be stopped? Before the late night begins, before the message is avoided, before the purchase is made, before the anger speaks, before the phone is opened, before the excuse becomes command. This is where the law becomes useful. If you wait until the door is falling, you will call the lesson painful. If you interrupt the first domino, you will call the same law freedom. Natural law has real consequences. That should not make you hopeless. It should make you precise. Because if consequence comes from cause, then the future is not only waiting to happen to you, it is being built. Not in slogans, not in intentions, not in the version of yourself you describe to other people, in causes, in repeated inputs, in what you permit when nobody is watching, in what you obey when comfort speaks, in what you avoid when conscience asks for action. The man who only studies collapse becomes afraid of life. The man who studies cause becomes harder to govern, because he stops asking only, "Why did this happen to me?" He starts asking, "What chain was moving before I noticed?" That question changes everything. It turns pain into information. It turns consequence into evidence. It turns responsibility into a point of command. So here is the test. Choose one consequence. Trace the chain. Name the first signal. Name the repeated cause. Name the excuse that protected it. Then interrupt the next repetition while it still looks small. Because the door does not close all at once. The law does not begin at the crash, and the next consequence in your life may already be moving through a cause you are still calling harmless. Stop looking only at the door. Find the first domino.